Thank you for coming, Doctor. I honestly didn't think the renowned psychoanalyst, Jeffrey Gilland, would see me. Then again, it isn't every day you are handed the opportunity to interview an insane colleague. And I am your golden ticket to a more profound reputation, aren't I? Please, you don't need that arched brow to impress me. I spent years trading theory and thesis with you, Jeffrey. Until you published your paper on paranoid delusionals, I thought I was the only one making any progress in schizophrenia research. But I see my banter is falling under speculative regard. Very well. Let's begin with the reaffirmation of patient ID. My name is Professor Randall H. Courtney. I maintain doctorates in the fields of psychology, psychiatry, psychobiology, parapsychology, criminology, and religious mythology. The latter is a particular passion of mine. Until recent events, I was the head of Western University's psychology department and a special consultant to both Western Community Hospital and the state-funded Pleasant Glen Home for the Criminally Insane, specializing in sociopathic and schizophrenic cases. I am 57 years old, moderately healthy, and unfortunately close to the precipice of insanity. Of course, you wouldn't be here if I weren't. To the heart of the matter, as you would tell me when I began a long-winded diatribe. Here, then, are the circumstances that led you here. It all began 2 weeks ago. I had read the case study of the holiday hacker, William James Morton, by Dr. Lansing in Athens. His paper discussed the complete personality and symptomatic juxtaposition of Morton. By all accounts, William James Morton was a classic case of a violent sociopath. He murdered 156 documented women and children from 1993 to 2013. Undeniably, Morton was the most prolific serial killer ever substantiated in his claims, unlike our tail-chasing study of Henry Lee Lucas A. As per the typical profile of a serial murderer, Morton was a white male in his late 30s, middle-income class, with a social magnetism that allowed him to make friends easily. Coupled with an unusually high IQ, Morton was well-liked by colleagues and friends who, of course, never suspected his nocturnal activities. Morton worked for the Indiana Public Utilities Commission as a meter reader. This gave him unlimited accessibility into his victims' homes, to which he would cleverly observe several potential targets for 2 to 3 weeks prior to making his move. All of Morton's victims were killed during holidays, most notably Christmas and Easter. As you know, Dr. Lansing asserts Morton was killed on holidays because his parents did not celebrate any of the accepted Christian holidays, and that either the indifference or non-participation of social interactions with friends and family created Morton's behavior. Unfortunately, Lansing never appropriately explored the aspects of his ritual abuse by his father or the sexual recriminations his mother heaped upon him. And let us not forget his classic disassociation with morality and accepted social behavior. I see you have no taste for debate tonight. Very well. Morton ritualistically entered the household of families, wherein the father worked a third or graveyard shift between the hours of 1 to 4 a.m. and proceeded to slit the throats of his victims, from oldest to youngest. His signature was the destruction of a major holiday tradition. Stripping a Christmas tree of ornaments, carrying up Easter baskets, shredding Valentine's Day cards, vandalizing the Thanksgiving centerpiece, etc. But you've already read Dr. Lansing's case study, Jeffrey? Of course you have. You know, on the night of December 24th, 2013, the Jeffersonville police responded to a 911 call from a half-dead Iris Dennison. By the time they reported on scene, all 3 children, aged 3 to 7, were found dead in their bedrooms, as was Mrs. Dennison, still clutching the bedroom phone. Amongst the carnage and destruction, they found the 510-meter reader balled up in the corner of the living room, covered in his own bodily fluids and the blood of his victims. The police report concluded with Morton's overwhelming confession and sorrow. What followed was the largest admission of serial murder ever made. As a matter of fact, when they found Morton's infamous tome of the season, the grisly journal of his slayings, I wager Morton told them where to find that damnable book. For some unknown reason, This brutal, remorseless killing machine was now raving like a paranoid schizophrenic in a highly manic delusional state. Morton was now begging to be locked away for his crimes. This complete change portends an emotional 180-degree spin on all our known beliefs about mental illness. Curious, don't you agree, Dr. Gilland? I see you are still not impressed. Very well. Let us move to the meat of the meal. The night of March 15th, the night Lansing and Morton died before my eyes. I must, however, warn you in good conscience. This tale will, no doubt, test the limits of your psyche. So I must ask you to suspend your disbelief until the tale is told. I cannot guarantee you will ever sleep soundly again, but you will know the unbelievable truth that has stolen my sanity and placed me here under guarded supervision. Before that fateful day, I had thoroughly studied Morton's Tom with avid interest. As a long-range researcher, Morton's Tom of the season provided an invaluable resource, the likes of which had never been seen before nor, I must suppose, will ever be seen again. Can you imagine a reference book for homicidal sociopaths written by a homicidal sociopath? This was no notebook of ranting against the machine of society, nor was it an incoherent catalog of instability. With an above-average IQ, Morton meticulously entered all thoughts, actions, and variables of each murder, down to any minute smell, taste, and touch he experienced. His view was frighteningly clinical. Even his penmanship looked antiseptic, not obsessive. Words cannot express the terror of his analysis or the sheer horror of Morton's accurate observations on the deaths of his victims. Honestly, Morton's brilliance in notation and observation would shame the efforts of our most esteemed research colleagues. This was also the opinion expressed by Dr. Lansing. That is why he allowed me to study the Tom as a precursor to meeting Morton. I believe the sheer immensity of the task at hand brought me into the fray. Perhaps it was the simple fact that Lansing needed an intellectual equal to back up his claims and save his reputation from the assertions he was about to make. Whatever the case, I should have politely denied him and continued my life in the blessed ignorance that will never again be mine. Here, then, are the events of March 15th. Dr. Lansing and I arrived at Pleasant Glen just before 6 p.m. We were both in good spirits, anxious about our first in-depth interview with the man the media had dubbed the holiday hacker. We had discussed the Tom during the 2-hour ride from the airport and had formulated a strategy for the interrogation of William James Morton. However, the strategy disintegrated once we occupied the room with this killer. Morton was escorted into a room no bigger than the average living room, bound in a formidable straitjacket. His eyes were glassy, wide, and darting, the epitome of a paranoid schizophrenic. He moved with shaky uncertainty, and if not for the armed guard, would have certainly fallen into the table instead of being seated at it. Lansing put on his psychiatrist's hat and went to work. "Good evening, William. My name is Dr. Lansing, and this is Dr. Courtney. We've come to ask you a few questions. Would you mind?" To this, Morton giggled and spat. "Your dime. Fire away." "We read your book, William," Lansing continued. "Why did you write it?" "For posterity, head shrinker. It doesn't make any difference." "Nothing does." He began giggling like a schoolboy with a secret. "What do you mean by that?" I piped in. "I feel sorry for you assholes. I really do," Morton said, rocking gently in his chair. "I'm going to pay for what I did, but you don't have a clue what's going to happen. Maybe if you explained it to myself and Dr. Courtney, we might be able to." "Save me," Morton cut in. "I don't think so. Head shrinker, can't you smell the doom? Taste the fear? Is it because of all the people you've murdered?" I asked. A sneer of righteousness crossed his lips. "No, not because of all the people I killed." "Would you mind explaining what you mean?" said Lansing. "You won't believe a word of it, but that doesn't matter. It's going to happen, whether you believe me or not. But I ain't saying nothing till you turn off those recorders. Agreed?" We heeded his request and turned off our recorders. He simply smiled at the two of us, and his eyes seemed to be clear and his demeanor altered. The armed guard behind Morton leaned against the wall, as if holding it up, oblivious to the conversation. "It was the last expedition I underwent," said Morton, "the Dennison family experiment. I am still sorry I did not have the time to record my observations. I found myself utterly without words as I listened to this madman speak without the previous trace of his drawl. His new verbal diction was measured, reflective, and almost nonplussed. It was then that an answer dawned on me for his abrupt and distinctive attitude alteration. The mystery of his 180-degree turn could be logically and anticlimactically explained. I jotted DID into my notebook and sighed in profound disappointment at such an obvious solution, which the psychiatric community used to call multiple personality disorder. "So it was one of the Dennisons you regret killing?" asked Lansing, as if he didn't notice the change. "Not for a moment." Morton's eyes sparkled. "Apparently, you forgot to read your paper on my aberrant behavior." Lansing shuffled uncomfortably in his chair without response. I quickly jumped into the fray. "What caused your radical behavioral change? Any idiot with half the imagination can fake paranoia and get more attention and stricter supervision by his captors." His voice was almost clinical in its approach. "A sociopath is simply locked into a cell, fed and watered as required by law, and forgotten. I cannot and will not be casually erased from existence. So you are perpetrating this ruse for attention," scowled Dr. Lansing. "For witnesses. Why would you need witnesses?" I interjected. "'Cause Santa Claus is coming to town," Morton sang in a sickly sweet child's voice. "I don't understand," I said. "I killed the jolly fat man," he said flatly. "What?" Lansing and I gasped in chorus. "I butchered Kris Kringle, Old Man Winter, Saint Nick, whatever you choose to call it." "What do you mean by it?" I asked. "Let me put it this way," Morton began. I could see his calm, controlled demeanor begin to crumble like a glass house from a stone's throw. "I have killed a lot of people. I know what death is. In all of my research, I have never seen anything like it. I might be a sociopath, but I am not insane. I know the direct effect of all my actions and am totally aware of every child and mother I put on the ground. But I will not be stalked by a figment of ceremonial imagination. When it comes to me, I want others to tell the tale. I will not be dismissed as some raving lunatic and have my observations shelved as another madman's delusion." "Enlighten us," Lansing asked with a certain smugness. Morton leaned forward on the table, which caused the guard to lazily mutter, "Watch yourself, Morton. I'm only a step away from busting your ass." "I'm sure you are," Morton dismissed the man. It was Christmas Eve, and I had just finished my experimentation on the children. "By the way, did you know you can open a child's jugular vein when they are sleeping, and they will continue sleeping into death, cradled in the warmth of their pooling blood? That is, unless you make noise or your instrument is not sharp enough." "Interesting," Lansing said, clearly uninterested. "Thank you, Doctor." Morton's voice was less than gracious. I believe that was the moment he began to lose interest in Lansing's presence and spoke directly to me. As I was saying, I had just completed my study and was busy leaving my calling card. "Defacing the Christmas decorations," I supplied. "Yes," he nodded to me. "It was during my ceremonial defacing of the tree when I heard a large thump, like a pot roast hitting the counter from 30 feet. "Pot roast?" "Yes, kind of a meaty plop." He looked directly into my eyes. I could tell the story was an attempt to reaffirm his tentative grip on what he considered reality. I turned around, expecting to find one of my victims in the survival category of willpower over wounding. Only 10% do, you know. "Interesting theory," Lansing offered, trying to re-establish his role in the conversation. "Could you offer more on this aspect?" "No." Morton dismissed Lansing and continued. I turned to find a fat man in a red and white suit. Yes, he was covered in ashes and soot. Yes, he had a big round belly, shaking like a bowl full of jelly. All the stereotypes were accurate. Santa Claus. The name escaped my mouth in reserved disbelief. In all his wonder, Morton's eyes began shifting to the barred window and back to me. The fat abomination started to laugh like life was all hearts and flowers, and all the holidays I never had were in the past and meant to be forgotten. He had the audacity to glorify a celebration that the Christians stole from the pagans and the capitalists stole from God himself. So I planted my scalpel in his chubby throat. What? My shock could not be contained. I knifed him, he said, with a cool, triumphant smile, and he had the nerve to spit out through the blood. You're being naughty. He pulled the scalpel out and picked me up off my feet and said, Santa doesn't like naughty little boys and girls. That tub of lard tossed me across the room like a rag doll. I remained silent. I had nothing to say to his unbelievable tale. You probably guessed that. It irritated me. He tried to shrug off the rest of the story, but it flowed from his lips like bitter wine. The first thing that came to hand was the Christmas tree stand, which lay discarded among the remnants of light strands and broken bowls. I used the stand to split its head open like an overripe melon. By the time I was finished, its head was a bloody bowl of red oatmeal. But it tried to get up. Can you imagine my surprise and frustration? No, I can't, I responded. Well, this was no experience a clinical man like myself was prepared to anticipate. I improvised, knocked it to the floor, severed its head from its body, and got myself together to leave. Unfortunately, Santa had wasted valuable escape time. I was trapped. My mind tried to figure out what to do next. That's when I heard a bloody gurgle behind me. Santa was on his feet, wagging a finger at me. He stopped for a moment to regain his composure. And, do you know what that bloated corpse said? What? Droned Lansing. I'll be back, you bad little boy, it said, then popped up the chimney and jingled off into the night. And this is your explanation for your abrupt change in behavior? Lansing scoffed. I can smell fish stories from miles away. Do you truly think I will report this hogwash? I don't care what you do, you academic leech, Morton growled. Why didn't the police see Santa fleeing the scene? Wouldn't they have been tipped off by Rudolph's nose lighting the way? Lansing taunted. Morton turned to me, his eyes intense and focused. I just needed a fellow colleague to listen and to know. I am surprised I have not been assassinated by now. I have spent too many nights wondering when my end will come. Now it doesn't matter if it comes for me. The story has been told. That is all. Indeed, sniffed Lansing. I have never heard such. Lansing trailed off, cocking his head like a collie to a dog whistle. Do you hear bells? At this point, reality crumbled. It was almost as if the terror was waiting for its cue to take the stage. The sweet sound of bells grew louder and louder as a red light from outside the window drew closer. Oh shit, it found me. It seemed Morton's persona switched again, and he struggled within his bonds. Let me out of this jacket, goddammit. The outer wall of the interview room exploded noiselessly into the dark night, collapsing as if hit with a great, silent force from inside the room. The dust swirled about the gaping maw as 3 of the 4 of us stood frozen in place. It found me. Morton shrieked as he pushed off his chair and tried to make himself small behind the interview table. The guard broke from his deep lethargy and pulled his gun. Freeze, you son of a bitch. He pointed the shaking weapon toward the hole in the wall. From a sleek, red, levitating sleigh, 2 smallish men, roughly 3 feet tall, with pointed shoes and ears to match, grinned maniacally and quickly disembarked. The obscene jingling of their droopy, conical hats mocked the viciousness of their body language. They stood like doormen at the sides of the missing wall, leering wildly at the bewildered foursome. Which one? Called one of the little men in a shrill soprano. We all held fast in pure horror as it stepped through the hole. It wore the suit of Santa and bounded from the sleigh with a jolly stride. All the myths were true, except for Santa's head. It was more an assembly of leftover parts from a slaughterhouse than a head with a pristine red hat. It looked like roadkill that had boiled on the unforgiving black asphalt for days. Jagged bone protruded from shredded, pulpy muscle as a dark-stained beard revealed a ruptured orifice, which could only be the mouth. It rasped in a voice of sandpaper and pain that pierced my very soul. Naughty. It pointed a gloved finger at the hidden serial killer. The men in green, elves, I would presume, advanced on Morton, glaring. Am I invisible? The guard barked, drawing back the hammer of his .40 caliber pistol. Now back the fuck up. I won't say it again. Faster than the mind could comprehend, one of the elves was upon him. Eyes wide with disbelief, the guard watched as the little man tore into his flesh like a rabid wolverine. The guard, I believe Carl was his name, found himself caught in the middle of an eruption of blood. His blood. Carl had the horrifying honor of watching himself being autopsied while still alive. His last memory was of his entrails sliding from his chest cavity and slapping the floor. He quickly collapsed on the gray-flecked institutional tile, his cocked gun still in hand. Finally, Lansing reacted. He vomited, spewing God's name between each hasty exit of the day's meal. The two elves pounced on Morton, hauling him to his feet amidst his tearful protests. The elves clamped around his bound arms like a metal vice grip. This only increased Morton's shrieking. And what, you may ask, was I doing during all this? Nothing. No, that is not true. I was trying to escape to the part of the mind we psychologists claim comatose patients go to when severely traumatized by life. My little place must have been closed for repairs, for I was forced to witness the hideous events that continued before my previously agnostic eyes. Morton continued sobbing and rocking in his straitjacket. Lansing continued vomiting and taking the Lord's name in vain, and I became a statue as the corrupted thing in the red suit advanced upon his elf book-ended victim. The thing's head contorted in an expression, which most likely was a smile amongst the shredded muscles of its face. It lifted Morton's tear-stained face with a gloved finger, as if examining a slave soon to be auctioned. No, please, no. I'll be a good boy, Morton pleaded to mutilated ears. The elves giggled knowingly. As if it were not surrealistic enough, Lansing came under control and tried asserting himself as the voice of reason. Can you imagine, Jeffrey? The old fool tried to rationalize with mythical characters in our unfathomable situation. I could smell death upon him even before he managed to spew his initial salvo of psychobabble. The elves released the whimpering Morton and focused on Dr. Lansing. Their movements would have shamed the best bodyguard or Secret Service agent as they swarmed Lansing. This situation has not become unsalvageable, Lansing said, smiling at the 3-foot gremlins. Perhaps we can avoid any further unpleasantness if we can allow ourselves a moment of reflection. One of the elves came face to face with Lansing, listening to his words with a contemplative face. The first elf nodded agreeably and said in that squeaky soprano, "No." With the stealth of shadows, the second elf neatly penetrated Lansing's back with a petite, clawed hand. The intrusion must have granted Lansing a form of anesthetic shock, for his face was less comprised of pain than of surprise. Whatever the case, Lansing fell to his knees immediately as I watched the demonic second elf play tug-of-war with Lansing's spinal column, while the first elf continued to lock his gaze onto Lansing, as if milking the suffering from the psychologist's eyes. The tug-of-war was being lost until the second elf put a foot on the doctor's back and wrapped its fist around the exposed section of his spine. Effort redoubled. Lansing's spine popped loudly, then slid from his body with a wet, sucking sound. The little monsters briefly considered Lansing's wide-eyed death mask, cackled gleefully, and went back to their original target, ignoring my useless presence. Maybe it was the dismissal of me as a harmless entity that awakened me. Vanity has always been a great motivator in our profession. It was as if the magical inner button had been switched off, for my senses had returned. I was wrapped in raging anger for the first time in my life, and it was my assertion that these abominations of nature needed to be brought to justice. At least I prefer to think my motives were purely altruistic instead of triggered through selfish preservation. My first thought was of my need for a weapon. I then remembered the guard's unfired gun. I mustered my courage and walked slowly toward Carl's mutilated body and my only salvation. They continued to ignore me, preferring to get the pleading Morton under control. I retrieved the heavy weapon without incident. Until that day, the thought of firing a weapon repulsed me, yet I was beyond the point of moral justification. My clinical world was at an end, and I was determined to survive the brave new world into which I had been so unceremoniously thrust. The unreality of the three interlopers blanketed the sobbing Morton. "Naughty," repeated the abhorrent Santa as his mitten-clothed hands reached for the pristine red hat on its mutilated head. "Naughty," I quietly mumbled. Actually, I believe I giggled as I said it. It was that giggle that alerted the elves. Both of the little green monsters spun on their heels and faced me like a Western showdown. I did not use hyperbole. I simply pulled the trigger. The gun roared, catching one of the elves in its slender neck. In fact, the .40 bullet nearly severed the elf's head. It sputtered some ancient gibberish and fell to the ground, twitching. Unfortunately, the remaining elf was quickly upon me, or rather, upon my leg. It lashed out with its savage claws, removing my patella with near-surgical precision, as if it were an old-fashioned bottle cap. Pain exploded across my being, yet this was not the time to recognize my shortcomings. I fell backwards and struck the unforgiving institution floor. I scarcely had the opportunity to blink before the little creature was upon my chest, set to strike the killing blow. "Dead," it shrieked, raising a gore-soaked talon. Yes, I smiled. I almost experienced a moment of pity for the little elf as it felt the gun barrel dig into its crotch. Almost. At close range, the bullet shredded through the elf, throwing its life body across the room. Believe me when I say this, Jeffrey. If I were you, I would be wearing the same disbelieving expression. Sometimes, in the silence of night, I myself have cause to doubt all that occurred in that antiseptic room at Pleasant Glen. Yet I cannot escape the conclusion. In the immortal words of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Here, then, is the most improbable fate of William James Morton. I struggled to my feet, the table a proper crutch to my shattered leg. Though it seemed like an eternity, I had dispatched Santa's helpers in a matter of seconds. I, unfortunately, did not miss the horror unfolding between Morton and the shredded Santa. Excluding the appearance of its head, the scene played out innocently. The obese dead thing removed the hat. To this end, the straight-jacketed Morton bellowed and squirmed like a worm on a hook. Santa calmly placed the hat upon Morton's head and chuckled, "Ho, ho, ho." Never had I heard a cry of such torment and terror as I heard that day, nor do I ever wish to hear it again. My blood ran cold as the holiday hacker, bound and helpless, called to a god he never believed in while the abhorrent creature offered a grotesque, gurgling chuckle. I raised my weapon, not knowing what I could do against his terrified screams. "Kill me." Morton's eyes locked to mine. "Kill me before it's too late." I leveled the gun at his head. The corpse Santa made no motion to stop me. "Please, please, please," Morton cried. "I can feel it. Hurry." I swallowed hard and squeezed the trigger. To this day, I do not know if I was too late or if the bullet would have had any effect had I delivered it sooner. Needless to say, I placed a bullet hole neatly in the middle of Morton's forehead. The bullet hole puckered, diminished, and sealed the flesh of his forehead as the manic terror in Morton's eyes swelled. The metamorphosis had begun. Before my eyes, the smallish frame of William James Morton expanded. Along with his growing girth, his facial features softened, leaving the terrified sociopath with puffy cheeks. His face erupted in white tufts of hair, with the hair upon his head lengthening in a shockingly snowy white. His restraints melted into a thick red blouse with matching pants as his bare feet became shod in shiny black boots. During this transformation, the thing that was Santa deflated like a balloon, slowly losing air. When it hit the cold floor, Morton rose to his feet. No, it was no longer William James Morton. Ho, ho, ho. It roared, jelly belly and all. As if on cue to this battle cry, the dead elves exploded, showering the room with large cottony snowflakes. At this point, my mind decided it had truly seen enough. I fell to the floor and began laughing as I tried to catch a snowflake or two on my proffered tongue. I wondered to myself how many I could catch before I bled to death. The new Santa looked at me for a moment and patted me on the head. "Now you are a good little boy." He offered a wink, thumbed his nose, and through the blasted portal he rose. Once through the hole in the wall, the crumbled bricks reformed and jumped back into place, resealing the room as if the intrusion never happened. My memories pick up in the hospital as an attending doctor told me I would most likely never walk again. I remember my comment being slightly sarcastic, but I cannot remember what I said. It really does not matter at this point. So Jeffrey, am I insane? Oh, don't look at me that way. I know that only an insane person could create such a fantastic world to play a scenario like this. If only the evidence did not exist to the contrary, eh? The psychiatric community will play it off as an extreme psychotic episode from a man who has worked too closely with his subjects. The local law enforcement, unwilling to advertise multiple grisly homicides, will be more than happy to agree and quietly close the case. However, before I am escorted back to my padded room, consider this. We, as a society, look to insane explanations to rationalize those topics that we personally do not wish to breach. Babies come from a benevolent stork, weather balloons cross the globe as UFOs, and the Son of God relieves the weight of personal sin through ritualistic torture and eventual death. In this pantheon, my greatest fear is reserved for a creature that keeps track of our morals, rewarding or punishing us for being nice or naughty. A beast that preys only upon the most innocent of our culture, children. A being that, despite the security alarms and fences, is allowed to enter our house and is given unrestricted access to our inner sanctum. We do not question his valor or mission. We simply expect this modern icon to perform in a righteous manner. But I must ask, what if this creature is not here for our mythical amusement? What if, like the old wives' tales of cats who steal children's sleeping breath, old Saint Nick has an ulterior, sinister motive? You know, Jeffrey, the suicide rate for Christmas is staggeringly higher than any other time of the year. Coincidence? Have we, in fact, unleashed a terror into our normal lives that sustains itself with supernatural malfeasance? Now, more than ever, I remain skeptical. No matter. I believe I will never leave this place. I have seen too much and perhaps said too much. My advice to you, dear Jeffrey, you better watch out. You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. Santa Claus is coming to town. Grinwald grabbed his son by his beaten breastplate and shook the hysterical young man, slamming him against a massive oak tree, nearly unleashing the chest piece in the process. "Horik," he screamed desperately, trying to break through the panic. "Compose yourself." It took a moment for Horik to fall silent, save for the hyperventilation and accompanying sobs, and Grinwald could see him returning to the man he was, the man he raised him to be. "Horik." He repeated it, this time with deserved compassion. The hell they had gone through was nothing he would have wished on any man, let alone his son. He was damn proud of the young knight. Horik nodded, his breathing slowly returning to normal, and Grinwald embraced him, causing their armor and chainmail to clank together. "I'm sorry, father," Horik whispered as they hugged. His father pulled him back while still holding his shoulders and locked himself into the younger man's gaze. Those eyes, it was so hard sometimes to look into his eyes and not see the child that he used to bounce on his knees. At times like these, however, those thoughts had to be kept as far from his mind as possible. Seeing his son like he was now, bloody and worn from battle, there needed to be a firm distinction between the two images, and Grinwald never quite found the balance. It was both a blessing and a burden to have his son fighting by his side. "You have no call for apologies, my son. I need only to know that my lead knight has returned to me." Horik nodded emphatically, and Grinwald knew the young man was back with him. It was not as though the histrionics weren't warranted. The quest bestowed by their king had become more perilous than anyone had imagined. With the 5 kingdoms on the verge of war, they had expected some light opposition, perhaps, but nothing along the lines of the Black Knight, who had been pursuing them from day one. The Black Knight was both a boogeyman tale to keep children in their beds at night, as well as a reality so much worse than any parent could dream of. A ghastly specter in his black, onyx-lined suit of armor. No one had ever seen his face or lived to tell about it. Aligned with evil spirits and steeped in black magic, he was known to travel with a variety of hideous mutated creatures he called his war beasts. There was an army of hell pigs, the Black Knight resurrected from the long-extinct intelligence, the prehistoric version of which were mostly herbivores. These, however, were bred with a thirst for blood, and were particularly useful when tracking over long distances. They were only the start. The Black Knight used his demonic magic to create a large number of mutated and previously non-existent creatures from a type of murder monkey with 3-inch fangs and razor-sharp claws that would swing through the trees above their victims and rain hell down upon them. The hell dogs bore a closer resemblance to something from the Jurassic period than actual dogs. The most feared of them all would be the bats. It was unknown if the Black Knight had a clever name for them, but they were definitely big and scary, often displaying wingspans of 10 feet in length and known to fly off with prey as large as horses. All in all, the Black Knight and his army were well known in all 5 kingdoms, but rarely, if ever, actually seen. Grinwald was certain his king would have never anticipated the myth coming to life over the course of the quest he had assigned. He had placed the container with the scroll in Grinwald's hands personally. "Sir Knight," the king had said, "this is of the utmost importance, and that is why I'm sending you and your order of knights. I trust no one else to the task. The kingdoms are in turmoil, and this will go a long way toward improving our kingdom. Place it in King Windemere's hands only. Do you understand?" Grinwald had. Windemere had been a powerful ally in the past, and it only made sense to combine their efforts once again. That had to be what the king wanted, but it might be even more important than that, as the pursuit made them believe. Grinwald and his knights were 9 in total, the Order of the Lance, and were in the king's favor. They were generally considered the greatest fighters in the kingdom, and the most frequently assigned to protect the king and queen themselves. Their abilities and bravado were unparalleled, and before the quest began, any one of them, with a pint of ale in their gut, would boast of the Black Knight not standing a chance in their presence. Was he more than a fairy tale? It became fairly clear that wasn't the case, however, and now the only 2 left living were firm believers. The first 2 died in an ambush that came in the middle of the night as they made camp. Caught completely unawares, the vicious hell pigs tore into the group as they slept, killing 2 immediately, and then another 2 who sacrificed themselves for the rest to escape. Had they not, the entire order would have been slaughtered. At one point, in an attempt to elude, Sir Latimore's horse lost her balance on the side of a mountain, plummeting them both to the distant ground and unfortunate graves. Later that same day, still doing their best to conceal themselves from the hellish army pursuing them, they lost Sir Vanimir to, of all things, quicksand. With no one even noticing, the brave knight sank stoically to his death without making a sound, not wanting to give away their hiding spot. The death was heartbreaking, there was no doubt, but it wasn't nearly as emotionally devastating as that of Sir Gilliant's. Claymore Gilliant was the same age as Horik, and the 2 young men had been nearly inseparable since they were old enough to run. Clay's only mistake was to touch an arrow. He literally did no more than pick up one of the Black Knight's arrows from the ground and toss it aside. He had no way of knowing. None of them could have, but they knew now. There were rumors about the broad sword the demon carried, and now they knew that it extended to the arrows as well. The recognizably black arrows were coated in dried poison, harvested from 1,000,000 Vika spiders, easily the strongest poison in all 5 kingdoms, and such that they needed only to touch the skin to begin working. In the 2 hours that followed that unfortunate incident, Clay deteriorated to a state that saw him crying for relief. It was Horik who provided that relief, and his mental state has been skewered ever since. On occasion, there were certain things that true friendship dictated one must do, things that one should never actually be made to do. What might seem to be a moment of mercy for one man could end up being a lifetime of torment for another. Grinwald had hoped that wouldn't be the case for his son. The final loss before it was just the 2 of them was perhaps the biggest blow to the mission itself. Sir Brute in Ithiscane was lovingly referred to simply as Brute, and Brute was, hands down, Grinwald's most valuable piece on the battlefield. An absolute mountain of a man, Brute's weapon of choice was his unbelievably heavy battle axe, which could separate 5 men from their bodies with one swing, but that was no concession to his abilities with other weapons. Brute was blessed with the ability to take life, and he took many, many lives before forfeiting his own. That happened only hours before, and it was very close to the thick forest where they now took refuge. The 3 of them were approaching the wooded area with as much speed as their exhausted and malnourished steeds would carry them when they were set upon from both sides by the Black Knight's cavalry. When it became apparent they would be unable to outrun the 6 riders closing the distance, Brute leaped from his horse, placing himself in their path. With wordless acknowledgement, Grinwald and Horik hurried on. Brute would give them as much time as possible to escape, even at the cost of his own life, a cost he was made to pay. The first 2 riders to meet him were cleaved from their horses with 2 swings while the beasts scampered off. The next 2 were dispatched with relative ease as well, with a small pile of body parts beginning to build around him before the 5th horseman arrived. Brute swung his axe at an angle, which, while killing the rider, managed to become stuck in the horse's spine. The beast squealed in pain as Brute struggled to pull the weapon free. He had just about gotten it out when a blade slid through his neck, decapitating him. Grinwald and Horik had gotten away. And now, while their horses drank thirstily from the only stream they could find, they tried their best to gather themselves. Their armor, beaten and caked with blood and dirt, was really no more than shredded chainmail, breastplates, and shin guards anyway, both having lost their helmets and various plates along the way. From just above the trees, they could see the rising pillars of smoke that were emanating from the Castle Windermere pyres. They were so close now. All they had to do was get to the other side of this damnable forest, and they would be close enough to the castle to signal for reinforcements. Were the Black Knight himself to meet them on the other side, it was highly unlikely that even he would want to tangle with the entire might of Windermere. They just had to get there. Grinwald could understand his son's desire to lose himself in emotion. They had suffered so much loss. The Order of the Lance were more than just his men to command. They were his brothers to die for. In the last 3 days, they had lost the closest family either of them would ever know, bearing their own relationship, and the losses hung heavy on their hearts. Falling to one's knees and crying hysterically felt like the more appropriate response to what they were feeling, but that wasn't a luxury a knight of the royal army was afforded. They had sworn blood oaths to the service of both the king and the kingdom. The message they were carrying, and in turn, the quest itself, was important to the king, so it was important to them. They owed their lives to the knighthood and its centuries of tradition, and were they to die in battle, no more honorable death could have been asked for, so they would push through. These were the moments that defined a man. The horses, while still hungry, satiated their thirst, and the ironclad father and son made their way back to the trail. There was a legitimate fear that their beasts of burden would not make it all the way. They had been ridden, very nearly, to the point of death. The stretch of forest they needed to traverse, while not exactly accommodating, wasn't too far, given the distance they had already traveled. The problem wasn't how far they needed to go. They realized almost immediately after getting back to the trail that the problem was going to be those damn murder monkeys. The knights could hear their simians say, "Oof, oof," and see their black, shadowy forms swinging through the canopies above them. They urged their mounts with unprecedented urgency, and the faithful stallions, Lancelot and Arthur, gave the men everything they had. Grinwald knew the effort would probably kill the horses, but there were things at stake greater than all their lives. The steeds ran like the devil was behind them. Unfortunately, the devils were above them, and their efforts just weren't enough. Rocks and sticks, and things much worse than either, began to rain down on them with painful intensity. Grinwald could feel Lancelot's muscles begin to weaken beneath his legs. The noble creature wanted to give him more, but there was no more to give. And he began to slow. It wasn't much, just a bit, but it was enough. A savage primate dropped onto Lancelot's back behind him, and began flailing at Grinwald's back and head. The majority of the blows struck the iron backplate before the knight could fling the miserable ape off the horse, but one well-placed slice from the razor-blade claws managed to peel away a generous portion of his scalp from the top of his head. The hair and skin, still attached on one side, began flapping around in what could, at best, have been called irritating. The adrenaline subsided any pain, but the blood that began to flow down his forehead and into his eyes was becoming a real detriment. Still holding the reins with one hand, Grinwald tried to wipe away enough blood to see with the other, as well as mushing the patch of hair back down. That damn flapping. They could just see the archway of light that represented the forest's exit when a stone the size of an orange struck Lancelot in the side of the head, instantly killing the horse and sending Grinwald flying forward through the air, flapping hair and all. Horik caught the carnage in his periphery and spun Arthur back around to get his father. Grinwald, with tactical instincts, tossed the scroll to the young knight. He was, after all, the only one with a horse, and therefore the best chance for the quest's success. "Now go," Grinwald screamed, waving his son on from beneath a hailstorm of monkey missiles. Horik went nowhere, however, and only waited with his arm extended to his father. "Just go. Complete the quest." Horik had returned to his stoic demeanor and only waited patiently for the older man to realize he wasn't going anywhere without him. It must have been plain in his eyes because Grinwald, in a bad tactical decision, mounted Arthur behind his son, and the two made their way to the edge of the forest. The monkeys got off a few extremely painful parting shots, but the men were able to cross the threshold of green into the open meadow. The horizon held Castle Windermere, and both men breathed a small sigh of relief at the sight of it. The sensation, however, was short-lived. Running parallel to the tree line, a single rider was approaching them with unbridled speed. The silhouette was as distinctive as it was terrifying. It was the Black Knight. Black armor with a spiked helmet sitting upon the largest black horse either of them had ever seen was like watching a nightmare come to life. The Grim Reaper himself. Horik spurred Arthur into as much speed as the poor animal could muster under the weight of two, and the men knew it wasn't nearly fast enough. At their current rate, the wraith would be upon them before they could get close enough to signal for help. A cloud of grass and dust gathered in the air from the small army of war beasts that galloped behind the Black Knight, a frenzied assembly of bloodthirsty nightmares dotting the landscape. The distance between the two parties was closing quickly. Grinwald swung himself around, putting his back to Horik's, to face the oncoming horde, the movement causing Arthur to buckle for a moment, and filling both men with the legitimate fear that the majestic steed had reached his end. The horse responded to the falter with a burst of increased speed. Arthur was going to give them everything he had left, but while they prayed it was enough, Grinwald knew that it wouldn't be. Once the gap closed to a few yards, the commanding knight screamed to his son, "Complete the quest. Horik, it's the only thing that matters," before flinging himself to the ground, sword in hand. "No," Horik shouted back, but it was too late. With the additional weight removed, Arthur's momentum increased, and the distance between the father and son was nearly immediately unsurmountable. There was no way Horik could have turned around to get him without sacrificing all their lives. For a brief second, the two knights met each other's gaze, and everything they both wanted to say was expressed in that wordless moment. It was goodbye for now. They would meet again in the halls of the great kingdom. The Windermere Castle began to slowly rise before Horik. First, the ramparts and battlements, then the gate and drawbridge, and finally the moat. When he could see the glinting light of the lookout spyglass in the tower, Horik grabbed the white flag adorned with their kingdom's coat of arms from Arthur's pouch and held the flag over his head. He turned his head to look back at his pursuers and found that they had stopped and gathered around his father and the Black Knight, who were locked in a rancorous battle. Looking forward again, Horik could see the drawbridge lowering, and what appeared to be at least 100 Windermere cavalry riders emerging, fully armored for battle. Reinforcements. It was reassuring enough that Horik brought Arthur to a stop and considered going back for Grinwald with the Windermere soldiers. He spun the horse around, but it was too late to do anything as he turned at the exact moment. The Black Knight's broadsword penetrated his father's heart, sliding through his breastplate and backplate both as though they didn't exist. Horik let loose a cry of utter anguish, which caught the attention of the Black Knight and his minions, but they didn't make a move in his direction. Horik could hear the galloping soldiers coming from behind him, and could only imagine that his adversary was smart enough to realize that it would be a battle he might not want to undertake. Already outnumbered, the tactician knew that a battle next to the strongest military castle in all 5 kingdoms would be, at best, unwise. Horik watched as the Black Knight unsheathed an arrow and placed it in his bow. There's no way he could shoot this far, Horik thought. He was wrong. The arrow flew further than any arrow Horik had ever seen and came within inches of striking Arthur. They probably would not have reacted so quickly. The Black Knight loaded another arrow, and Horik set the steed in motion toward the castle, desperate to increase the distance. With a high-pitched whistle, the arrow flew past his face. Horik didn't look back and didn't slow down. The soldiers had stopped about 50 yards away from them, no doubt seeing the insane distance the Black Knight was achieving with his shots. 40 yards, 30 yards, 20. This had to be far enough. Horik had nearly given way to relief as he had reached the safety of numbers when there came another whistle. Reflexively, he turned his head towards the noise just in time to see the black blur glide by his face, grazing him on the cheek. The cut was paper thin, with only the smallest line of red to indicate any form of contact, but the stinging was immediate. By the time he was being escorted across the drawbridge, Horik began to lose control of his muscles, and he fell from his horse to the wooden bridge, nearly tumbling into the mole in the process. The closest men jumped from their horses to help him up, but were wary to touch him. The veins in his face became black and necrotic around the small cut. The effects of the sorcerer's poison were becoming obvious. They wanted to retrieve the scroll then, knowing that the knight would not live long and was afraid of contamination, but Horik was not having it, his father's voice echoing in his head. Complete the quest. It's the only thing that matters. There was no way he would betray his father and his king in the closing moments of his life. After a few moments of deliberation, the knight was rushed to King Windermere's viewing chambers. By the time he was face to face with the king, Horik was unable to stand on his own, and barely had the energy to reach into his pouch and hand the scroll to him. The pain was immense and overwhelming, and Horik knew it would only be a matter of minutes now. Apparently, they all knew. The king read the note gravely, and then turned his attention to Horik's dying gaze. "My dear knight," the king's voice was soft with compassion, "you have completed your quest with great honor, your Ditsu, and your order will be recorded in our annals. Is there anything, most noble man, that I can do for you before you leave us?" Horik nodded his head. There was one thing that he knew would help him to pass peacefully to Valhalla. He wanted to know what great cause would come about from the deaths of his brothers, his father, and himself. The message, he whispered hoarsely, barely able to produce the words. What was the message from our king? King Windermere looked at the scroll in his hands, then back at Horik, then back to the scroll. Are you sure, Sir Knight? I'm not certain that will help. Please. Horik cut him off. The king nodded somberly and proceeded to read the scroll aloud, just finishing the message as Horik took his last, pain-filled breath. My dearest King Windermere, given the state of political unrest in the Five Kingdoms, my advisors have informed me that travel between our two kingdoms could be extremely hazardous for the time being. For that reason, and with great apologies, I regret to inform you that we will be unable to attend the celebration for your daughter's 15th birthday in 2 weeks' time. We will, of course, send a lovely present with an assembly of knights, perhaps the Veritas Order, in the near future, so please look forward to that. Thank you so much for the invitation, and we look forward to visiting in the future. Sincerely, King Claudius Protorius P.S. The Queen requests the recipe for the lovely cake we had during our last visit.